Well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for this latest in the IEA series of broadcasts. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Earlier this week, speaking in Dudley, on a podium inscribed with the words "Build, Build, Build," Prime Minister Boris Johnson set out his new plan to get the United Kingdom economy back on track after COVID-19. At the heart of the Prime Minister's pledge is £250 billion of investment in infrastructure and a promise that after this economic downturn, Britain will not return to the age of austerity. Quite how that's defined is something we might come on to. Billions will be pumped into the NHS, schools, rail, the internet, and in building more homes. Perhaps the best news for people of a free market perspective is the setting up of a new Project Speed, which aims to take a scythe through red tape and to get things done, to quote the Prime Minister directly. But are the PM's plans really enough to get Britain's economy back on track as we slowly exit lockdown? What more could the government be doing to reinvigorate our economy, ensuring that we make up lost ground fast, but then actually return to some meaningful levels of growth? To consider this conundrum, I'm joined by two brilliant guests who will share with me their discordant and eclectic views on the topic. First, we're joined by Bim Afolami. Bim is the Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, having represented that constituency since 2017. He's previously served as a PPS to the Secretaries of State for International Development and for International Trade, and he currently serves as the PPS to the Work and Pension Secretary, Therese Coffey. Bim is also on the advisory board of the Social Market Foundation and has recently published a report with them titled Unlocking Britain, Recovery and Renewal After COVID-19, which looks at these very questions. How do we get the economy back on track? Very warm welcome to you, Bim. It's fantastic to have you with us. Great to see you again.
Good to see you.
And we're also joined by Julian Jessop, a regular on the IEA London YouTube channel. Julian's an economics fellow here at the IEA. He's an independent economist with over 30 years of professional experience. He's previously worked as our own chief economist here at the IEA and as the head of our Brexit unit. He's written dozens of reports for the Institute, and most recently, he co-authored a report titled Rebooting Britain, How the UK Economy Can Recover from Coronavirus. It seems every think tank's in this game at the moment, right? And of course, it's about the most important thing that we can consider. So, Bim, I want you to set the table for us, set the stage. Tell us a bit about your Social Market Foundation commission, what problem you were seeking to solve, and crucially, what brought that commission together and what were your findings? What's the core of your recommendations been?
So first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with you all. So what was the genesis of this whole thing? So, obviously COVID happened, lockdown had happened and had been announced, sitting at home, working from home, and receiving, literally every 5 minutes, emails from people who ran businesses, who worked for businesses, who were just so worried about their economic prospects as a result of COVID. They understood, obviously, the reasons for the lockdown. They understood why things have been shut down, but they were incredibly worried. And I started to think that the biggest thing we're going to have to do out of this is recover economically. And I thought to myself, how can I make a difference to this? Because the government and politics more generally and MPs were very much focused, quite understandably and quite rightly, on the health challenge, because at that point the health challenge really was incredibly acute at the beginning of lockdown. And I started to think, well, if I can start doing the thinking now about the economic challenges, that will be important as we seek to come out of this. So as a means of trying to do that, I thought, well, one of the difficulties with reports done by MPs or think tanks or academics is they often have very good ideas. But the key thing with an idea is really twofold. The first is it's got to have practical application. It's got to be something that people who are in that particular part of private industry or actually put money to work in the economy, they think is a good idea and can practically work. Because something that can academically think is a good idea or even legally seems like a good idea doesn't necessarily always make it in practice. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that it can have their support, it can have their buy-in, it can have credibility on the basis that it isn't just Bim sitting down with some ideas and is, over a few weeks during lockdown. This is the sort of thing that can be backed by serious people who are active in business and in the economy. So what I do is I pull together a group of people, what I call rather grandly called my commission, and I called it Unlock Britain, though I could have used rebooting, Julian, I could have used that phrase. But Unlock I thought was all right. And the range of experience was really phenomenal. So I got people like economists like Gerard Lyons, who I'm sure is very well known to the IEA, financiers like Dame Helena Morrissey, trade experts like Shankar Singham, business people like the CEO of ASOS, Nick Baton, Chris Hewlett, who was the co-founder of Octopus Group, both fund manager and energy business. So I pulled together, and many others, a very successful house builder from the East Midlands called Guy Higgins, range of different, and others, a range of different people to help me road test and help me develop some ideas that can improve the British economy. And in the end, we came up with 10 ideas. There were more, but some of them were rubbish, so we took them out. And we boiled it down to 10 ideas that could have a key long-term impact on the British economy, but they were things that could be done reasonably quickly. These are things that can be done in this parliament. So what were those ideas overall? The first idea, and the one that got sort of most attention when I brought it out, was the idea of trying to provide more equity to our SMEs, because a lot of the SMEs have a huge amount of debt coming into this crisis. They've taken on debt to get through the crisis, and there's a real need to recapitalize those SMEs so that they can help power our growth getting out of this crisis, because SMEs are the engine of growth, not just in this economy, but in most economies across the world. So one idea is around that. Other ideas around maybe picking a nominal GDP level target rather than just having in monetary policy, rather than just having an inflation target. That was an idea, and I was me and Gerard Lyons spoke a lot about that, and he was very strongly of the view, and he persuaded me that this was a very good thing, ranging to ideas around supply side on planning reform. So ideas about how we could deliver housing and infrastructure much faster within the current legal framework, actually not having to make huge changes to the planning system, though, by the way, I think we need to make huge changes to the planning system for many reasons. I picked things, a way of delivering this much faster that we could do within our current planning framework. As I say, it was designed to try and get things done reasonably quickly rather than having to redesign everything from the start. So there was supply side on planning. There was some stuff around making government more efficient, making it smaller, taking out a whole tier of local government. We have local government and devolution more broadly, but local government is what I focus on, is a bit of a mess. We've introduced mayors into metropolitan regions. In the counties, we have often 3 tiers. Mostly we have 3 tiers of government: the parish council, parish and town council, district council, county council. It's a real mess. You've got the district council is responsible for planning, and yet the county is where you can have strategic look over what's needed, and they're responsible for transport, yet they're not responsible for planning. There's so many difficulties to do with it from an infrastructure and housing perspective. But just, if not more importantly, when it came to different levels of government, was that for businesses, speaking to the businessmen in my commission, talking about the difficulties of just doing business in a different part of the country, the number of different people you have to speak to, the different incentive structures, the way how there isn't, an easy way to speak to the right people in government who have the right ability to do what you need to get business going. Again, smaller, more efficient, more streamlined government, I think, is really needed. And by the way, that saves the taxpayers money as well. So that's another idea. One idea that was there that I've had is there's a big focus around developing our manufacturing sector. And we do that not necessarily by public spending in the old-fashioned way, but we do that through a 21st century version of enterprise zones. I call them opportunity zones. And I didn't make that up. It's actually something that came from the US. The US has, they've, over the last few years, brought in a thing called opportunity zones, which, loosely speaking, is a way of providing real long-term tax incentives. So not things that you can just get the benefits for a year or two and then leave. Longer term tax incentives, particularly around your capital gains, that can incentivize people to invest in particular regions. And it's building in regulatory terms on the free ports agenda himself is very keen on, and that we're already starting to progress in government. And one other idea that I mentioned is getting more people into STEM. You know, STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths, is something that governments, everybody in education sector has been talking about for a very long time. We know that it's critical for our success in certain areas of the economy, but it's difficult to get more high quality people in STEM, and when they study STEM, getting them to stay in it. And so one idea that I had is for top STEM students, forgiving their student debt if they work in a STEM, in the industry in STEM for 5 years after graduating. And we also give tax incentives to employers who take on STEM apprentices to be full-time employees. So again, it's trying to help bolster that sector combined with the tax incentives to get people investing in opportunity zones. That's another way of helping rebuild our manufacturing base. So they're some of the ideas.
Ben, that's fascinating, and thanks for that thorough overview. But what I'm really keen to do is to really drill down into the depth of some of these ideas and other alternatives. I'm also going to be intrigued to know if you're going to share with us any of the ideas that you binned or didn't think that would work. But Julian, I want to give you the stage here. You heard this smorgasbord of ideas that can get the economy going again from Bim and his Social Market Foundation Commission. What's your view of it as somebody from a market-leaning perspective? Are there any of these that stand out to you as being just the silver bullet the UK economy needs? And are there any that you think might be misfires if we put them in the gun? What's your audit of Bim's recipe for recovery and growth?
Okay, well, Mark, at the beginning you suggested I give Bim marks out of 10. Actually, it's quite easy to do because he does have 10 key proposals in his report. And I think I've gone through them all, and I think I'm going to give him 8 out of 10, which is, I think, a very respectable mark. Amongst the 8, there are lots of things to like in there. I mean, obviously, the emphasis on planning reform, on making it easier to do things. I mean, that's something that the government has been talking about for a while and was in the Prime Minister's Dudley speech. But the more that we can do there, the better. I like the idea very much of simplifying the various tiers of local and central government. And this is something that the IA has written about in the past, the importance of giving more control to the regions. Those countries and parts of the world that are dealt best with the coronavirus crisis have tended to be those that are more decentralized, that have more sort of competition in ideas and more devolution of power to those people in the best position to make those decisions. So anything that reforms planning law, makes it easier to build, whether that's a house or a hospital or a bridge, I think has to be a good thing. And making sure that those decisions are taken at a local level and as simply as possible in terms of the procedure, the better. So lots of stuff there. Obviously, opportunity zones, again, is very much along those lines. So 8 out of 10, where are the 2 marks lost? Well, there are 2 half marks lost for 2 proposals that I'm not really sold on. The first of those is the so-called COVID recovery fund, which has been explained was the idea of providing equity finance to SMEs in particular. And I'm wary about this because I'm not convinced it's the role of the government to invest in individual companies. Now, I'm aware the specific proposal dealt with at least part of that concern, because what would happen is that a fund would be set up, it would be run by private sector managers who are investment experts. It wouldn't be run by bureaucrats in Whitehall or by politicians. So investment decisions would be made by people who are, hopefully good at making investment decisions. But in dealing with that concern, it sort of begs the question of what is the government doing that the private sector isn't already doing? If a company is a good investment in the view of a private sector manager, why isn't the private sector already investing? I appreciate the government might have an advantage because, of course, its cost of capital is lower. So the hurdle rate of return that this new fund might have could be lower than a normal private sector fund. But apart from that, I'm a bit wary that this is the government sort of taking decisions about which sectors to invest in, something I think should be left to the private sector as far as possible. And it's not as if there isn't enough money sloshing around with very, very low interest rates already. So I'm not sure about that. The second one I'm not convinced about is the nominal GDP target. Now I'm a good friend of Gerard Lyons, so I should probably go away and he and I should thrash this out between us. My gut feeling though is that we have a monetary policy committee at the moment. It's got a fairly straightforward mandate that everybody understands, which is to target inflation of around 2%. In practice, this is a fairly flexible target over several years, so they can afford to look through the impact of various short-term shocks that might blow them off course. And this policy has been reasonably successful at anchoring inflation at around 2% for pretty much as long as I can remember. So part of my thinking is, if it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. I think also that if you were to lose the focus on inflation, then you will get a problem of bigger inflation further down the line, particularly given the huge amount of money that's been pumped into the economy over the last few months. If you believe that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, there is a potential inflation problem down the line. And the thing about a nominal GDP target is, in principle, it makes it indifferent between real growth and inflation, which I don't think is the right place for a central bank to be. That said, I can see the advantages of it as well. It would, for example, mean that we could try and boost nominal GDP growth over the next few years, which is a good way of getting the burden of debt down. It might also reduce some of the onus on fiscal policy to support demand. So rather than the government having to borrow and spend enormous amounts of money to prop up the economy, the central bank could do it through guiding nominal GDP growth. And I think a lot of these decisions would rather be made by officials and members of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England than by politicians. So I can see some advantages there. So I'm sort of half and half on the nominal GDP target, half and half on the COVID recovery fund.
But there's going to be one thing where there's definitely a full minus point. I can sense that's coming.
Exactly.
Right? Point of real dispute.
I know. Well, this is very much sort of from a free market perspective. What's the proposal basically to force private sector schools and private universities to share their learning materials with people in the state sector. Now, as it happens, I think in principle that's a perfectly good thing, and indeed many private schools and private universities are already doing that. And from Eton downwards, they are, during this crisis, putting their material online for students to access. But at the end of the day, I think that should be left for them to do. After all, it is their intellectual property. I mean, they are they're in the business of selling education, and forcing them to give a large amount of their product away for nothing, I think is the wrong route to go, particularly when in practice a lot of them are doing this already voluntarily. I think we don't need the stick of the state to wade in and make everybody do it.
Okay, well, let me, I want to dig down a bit more into some of these points. And Bim, perhaps I can come back to you initially on SMEs, the backbone of the economy. Very interesting. I think I'm broadly right. I haven't got the statistics to hand here, but new businesses in America tend to be about 80% equity financed and 20% debt financed. And I think you flip that on its head over here. It's sort of 80% debt financed and only 20% equity financed. But to Julian's point, and I'll just add to that as well, if you like, what is the problem here that you're trying to solve? We have the enterprise investment scheme, we have venture capital trusts. I mean, the market can go and invest in SMEs if they think there's a reasonable rate of return there. And, some SMEs will have a good rate of return, others won't. So although I'm sort of with you in seeing SMEs as a crucial part of the economy, I'm not quite sure what you think the problem is that requires a government policy to be a solution. Perhaps you could say a little more about that.
Look, it's a really good point, and I know in conversation with the Treasury, there are Treasury officials who say the same thing. So it's not something that isn't shared by others. Let me explain how I think about it. Look, you basically there are going to be three types of SME once the bulk of this crisis is behind us. Okay, you're going to have SMEs that are fine, paid off their debt, no problem, all fine, done, don't have to worry about them. You've then got SMEs that, frankly, their business model wasn't great, or something happens, and there's nothing you can do to save them. It's the natural capitalist, it's what happens in a capitalist system, and a lot of companies are going to go bust, right? That's going to happen, nothing you can do. But then there's a third group who can keep going, they don't go bust, they can actually pay their debt in the most part. But by paying back this debt, which is now as a percentage of their revenue, because their revenue is down because we're in economic difficulty, again, not through a fault of their own, in whatever market they're in, because their revenue's down, percentage of the debt they have to their revenue has gone up. So actually, what they have to pay back, paying back that debt is going to stop them growing their business because they've got a certain amount of cash. That money goes on the debt. It stops them expanding, stops them hiring more people, stops them doing things. Now, so the first thing I'll say is we are focusing on this third type of company. That's not all SMEs, but it's quite a big chunk of them. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is the core problem, and the question I always ask myself as a conservative and a free market conservative, and you, Mark, we've known each other for a long time, is why isn't the private sector doing this? And the reason why the private sector isn't doing this, and I can say I've had calls from across the city in the last few weeks talking about this idea, and there are a lot of people thinking about this sort of thing, is the following. The first is a lot of the SMEs I think we need to invest in that third group are reasonably small in terms of revenue. So we're talking about SMEs that maybe have revenues between 10 to 50 million pounds. That's not very big. Big funds, whether in the City of London, aren't comfortable investing in those small SMEs. Why is that? Because they find it hard to value them. They find it hard to work. And even if you could value them, it's not very liquid, they would feel, their investment, and how do they get out of it when they want to, and their investors will be. So part of it is that. The second one is the return that the government gets, or the fund would get, should I say, does not need to be as high as it would be for a private sector investor. Not only is the cost of capital lower, but also the aim of the fund, really, in my view, should be a little bit above making the taxpayer whole. You wouldn't really have to go much further than that. And whereas a typical fund, even if it was long-term pension fund, or even if they weren't looking for particularly high investment, would have to do significantly better than that. And the benefits of investing in certain SMEs, even if it was only mildly financially beneficial, these have local benefits, regional benefits. They can have longer term benefits that will outlast the length of any fund. And so it's the sort of thing where the government, taking a long-term view, may wish to invest in, that a private fund may not wish to invest in. But having said all of this, and by the way, this comes out, I did mention this in my report in a throwaway line, but it comes out in conversations I've had subsequent to this idea, so I'm slightly cheating, is that I don't necessarily think and I mentioned the fund should be about 15 billion, and that's sort of on discussion with various people as I put together the report. I don't think all that money necessarily needs to be public sector money. I think that actually the better model would be the government putting in a significant part of that, but also being joined by private sector investors in that fund. So I do think that it doesn't all need to be government money. I think that there'd be a lot of private sector investors that would invest alongside government in that sort of fund. And that would also give more confidence, people like Julian, that this would have more commercial viability. If you couldn't find private sector investors willing to invest alongside government, then it would tell you that you probably haven't constructed it very well. Because actually there are certain things that the government, by getting involved in providing a lot of cheap capital, that reduces the cost of capital overall of the fund in terms of the return, and critically, it will give the private sector confidence in a certain type of way. So I do think that it's an idea with merit, but I do also recognize, and I struggled myself very much with how do you do this in a way that avoids the moral and economic hazard that both you, Julian, and Mark have outlined.
Okay, that's really interesting. Julian, let me just come back to you on that. Does that assuage any of your fears? And perhaps I could be more purist still. Explain to me why you agree with Bim that a kind of normal or higher rate of return isn't necessary. I mean, isn't the big challenge to boost the economy after lockdown is to have a highly efficient allocation of resources? And if we've got resources allocated to a particular area that's sustainable but low return, well, that's a misallocation. We want the resources applied to areas that have a really high rate of return, right? So I was just a bit worried that both of you seem to be accepting that, well, the rate of return might not be great, but it's viable. Don't we need something that's a bit beyond viable, that's actually optimal? Julian?
Well, it depends what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to boost growth, then you need to have projects approved, that not just those that deliver high returns, but also those that deliver low returns, as long as those returns are more than the cost of the capital that's been used to fund them. And that's where the government has the key advantage, because for obvious reasons, its cost of capital is relatively low. And as Bim also suggested, it might have a lower rate of return for what you might call non-commercial reasons. If you're viewing a company as particularly important for regional development, for example, you might see sort of broader economic and social benefits beyond those that might accrue to the company itself. So I think that there is definitely something in what Bim is saying there, but I'm still not convinced. I mean, I'd love to be in the room with the Treasury officials. I suspect that they would be making similar points to those that I've been making as well. For example, I'd be concerned about the implications for competition. So we'd be talking here about supporting small businesses that exist at the moment, that for one reason or another have built up huge amounts of debt. We would give them an advantage through this fund, because they will be able to swap some of that debt for equity and be put in a better position. But are they necessarily the companies we want to support? What about sort of new companies that are coming along that haven't had that benefit of what is in effect state aid? Is there not a risk there that we are distorting the market in some way? Even that point about thinking about the broader and economic social benefits. Again, you are starting to make judgments that are straying away from allocating things on the basis of market principles towards, which areas, for example, do you want to support more than others? And I'm sure that, rightly or wrongly, politicians will be lobbying that a certain company that operates in their constituency is far more important for the economy than something, a company operating in somebody else's constituency. So I would still be concerned that these things would be getting a bit muddled. And then finally, actually, sorry, just brief, I wouldn't be reassured by the fact that private companies are coming on board alongside the government, because that would simply say to me, well, actually, why can't we just let them get on with it? If they're only willing to invest with public money, then maybe that is a warning sign that there is a problem there. Sorry.
I'll give you the comeback on that.
The thing I just push back on slightly is it's really, really important as you design this that it would be done at an arm's length. You cannot have a system where I bump into the Chancellor in the voting lobby and I say, gosh, have you thought about that toolmaker in Hitchin? They need to get investment. I mean, that can never work. And if you ever got into that place, we'd rightly be castigated. You cannot have that. In fact, not just MPs, the Chancellor shouldn't be able to do that. And I think you would have to put those very clearly in the terms. But if we sort of get through all the detail of this, conceptually, philosophically, right? Philosophically, the point here, I think, is sound, which is this is an extraordinary situation. And in an extraordinary situation, if the government help provide capital that can be used, and you can assess it on some objective basis that can be used positively to help power growth, that is something we should consider. I think that the point you made around new and emerging companies is a really good one, because effectively you're favoring incumbents by doing this, because they already exist by definition. So I do think that's a really strong point, and I think there are all sorts of other things you need to be doing to support new companies.
Okay, let's move on from a point where there was some possible modicum of agreement to a point where there seemed to be fundamental disagreement between the two of you. And this is on the private sector schools point that Julian raised. I mean, come on, Bim, you're a free market kind of person. I mean, why should this happen any more than the pub industry's in trouble, so breweries have got to give them free beer? ITV's in trouble, so the Premier League have got to give them free football matches. Bookstores are in trouble, so Penguin have got to provide them with free books. This seems to be an extraordinary, specific, unfair and prejudicial transfer of property from one particular private sector area of the economy to one particular public sector area of the economy, isn't it?
So there are two reasons. One, and I went to private school myself. I think they're very, very important. And I think that, and Eton that Julian mentioned, I know is doing a huge amount with Eton X, that they've developed this fantastic digital, online digital information and teaching materials that are really, really brilliant. So, and Helena Morrissey, as it mentions on my commission, is a governor. And actually, this idea came out of hearing and talking to her about how sort of inventive, innovative, digital learning can be really, really powerful in education. And I thought it was important. Why do I think private schools should do this? A, transfer of property only is the case if you are transferring legal title. I did not say that the ownership should not remain with the creator of the intellectual property. So that's the first thing. The second thing is education is not the same as other markets, as other products in other markets. We all understand that to be true. And I'm not making a moral judgment. It is taxed in a different way, which is also something we all understand to be true. We have accepted in our society that the provision of private education is not the same as just a car company or a supermarket. It isn't quite the same. There is a social obligation that the schools have. And that social obligation can be played out in lots of different ways. And different schools have different resources and there are different needs in different parts of the country. I just think that, again, this is a crisis. This isn't forever. This isn't necessarily something that we now need to impose upon everybody. And frankly, there are a lot of schools that haven't created innovative online teaching materials. But I just think in education, if you've got private schools that have done this, to just give other schools the benefit of that, a bit like how a lot of private schools allow state schools locally to use their playing fields at certain times, or swimming pool, or athletics track. I see this as a tech version of that. It doesn't remove the property. They can still sell it. It would only be in the UK. It wouldn't be that they'd have to give it internationally. And it can be licensed to be done on a particular basis. But I've seen that there are a lot of state schools that, frankly, and I think a lot of this is because of certain attitudes within certain parts of the state teaching profession, particularly the heavily unionized parts and certain people, but by all means not all, that they didn't find it as easy or as quickly to adapt to the new normal of teaching. I think the private schools have done a fantastic job in doing that on the whole. And I just think, let's not allow those kids to suffer for that. Let's see where there's the opportunity. Let's make that available to them, again, in a fair, licensed way, where the private schools, the people who created the intellectual property, will still keep it.
Julian, is that right? Education is different and should be treated differently, and this would help the perhaps slightly more sluggish state sector, take a couple of leaps forward for the benefit of the children in that sector.
I'm afraid I'm still not convinced. First of all, just to reiterate, in principle, I'm all in favour of private sector institutions sharing whatever they want with.
But not by government mandate, right?
Not by government. No, exactly. I do feel uncomfortable. I know Bim made a couple of points there. The first is the idea that sort of legally you retain title for it. That is true, but just because legally I own my garden, I still might have some concerns about people walking across it. So I'm not sure that point is particularly strong. I also think that there is a concern, as you say, about a lot of the quality of what's provided in the state sector. I'd actually rather invest directly in that to try and bring that up, rather than do anything that might appear to bring the private sector down. So if, for example, I were running a private university that was doing my best to attract students, and in practice a lot of the material that I would be providing for them would be available online, then that's a clear threat to my business model. I take the point that you can probably put some sort of protections on it and so on and so on, but realistically we know those protections are not great. So I think it would be obliging people to put out in the open something that's their own valuable intellectual property. I just feel uncomfortable with that. I also just wonder how actually necessary it is. I've not looked into this as much detail, clearly you and your commission has done, but I'll be surprised if this isn't happening already. Even if only a few schools are doing it in the private sector, then given the nature of this sort of material, it can be scaled up and used by a very, very large number of state schools. Yeah. So why would you have to force every private institution to do this? Why not just let those few that are doing it lead?
To be honest, I'm not convinced. We're not necessarily disagreeing that much. We're really disagreeing about the level of compulsion, if any, right? And so I'm very, very willing to say that, I think we've passed too many laws generally anyway. I'm not sure necessarily it is needed to pass a law by statute and force them to do it, or the Charities Commission to go and do this. But I suppose by putting it in there, what I was trying to do is to lean very heavily in the direction that this is what should happen. I'm very willing to accept the criticism, very willing, that compulsion is going too far. I'm very willing to accept that. You're right that it is happening already. You know, a lot of private schools have good links with their local community state schools, etc. So, you know, I'm sort of agreeing with you. I'm always unhappy with compulsion, but I also think that it's, you know, I often think that sort of narrative and what you're expected to do, a bit like when we talk about charity funding in the US, rich people in America give more to charity. Why is that? Because it's just what you're expected to do when you have a certain amount of money. In the UK, we just, for whatever reason, don't necessarily place those sorts of expectations on people with resources. Again, I don't think we should tax them more and force them to give money to their local church roof or whatever. But I do think that creating the atmosphere where that is more accepted or more expected, should I say, is a good thing. But look, I hear your criticism, and frankly, I'm tempted to agree with it. Compulsion is too far.
We're
That's a way of cheating. It's a way of cheating.
I want to bring in two more points, which two more quick points, which are areas where I had concerns. I guess Julian might have been less of a strict marker than me, Bim. You might have got a 7.5 from me. You got an 8 from Julian, but there were two areas that I wanted to probe you a bit more on. And those are the opportunity zones and the deal for STEM students. And perhaps I can start with opportunity zones, because I'll readily admit I'm a bit betwixt and between on the whole enterprise zone thing. On the one hand, I love the idea, because if you can remove regulations in particular areas or lower taxes, why would a free market liberal like me be against it? Although I sometimes flippantly say I'm not in favour of enterprise zones plural, I'm in favour of enterprise zone singular, and that zone should be the United Kingdom. And once you start saying, well, this neck of the woods has got a different set of rules to that neck of the woods, it ends up with a risk of market distortion, which I could see if the problem you were dealing with had fallen enormously disproportionately. So for sake of argument, going back to the 80s where the coal mining industry more or less shut down, you could see that, for example, the Rhondda Valley might have needed to become an enterprise zone in a way that London didn't. But to make a huge, broad, sweeping suggestion, this pandemic has hit all of the country on a broadly proportional basis. It's not as if Yorkshire has suffered terribly, but Surrey has been fine. So can you... Bim, can you sort of assuage my fears on this? That, I mean, aren't we just going to be sort of picking postcode winners? Because it's not particularly obvious that any given postcode area needs more help than any other to recover from COVID-19. As I say, that's a broad generalisation, but seems to me to be a fair one. So why don't we just sort of cut, I don't know, corporation tax across the board or deregulate certain areas across the board?
So the first thing is, and this is a political rather than a philosophical point, I'm in agreement with you. I'd love enterprise zone, but I'm a politician, and you've got to think of things that can practically get done, and things that can get through, and things that do not get held up for other reasons. So I think that and free ports again is the same principle. I'm sure if you asked the Chancellor when he put this together, he'd have loved for literally every single port to be a free port. But, that just isn't the world that you live in politics. And so I think you can do some things, so let's do them. But the broader point about market distortion, I think, is very important. Right? The whole point of doing opportunity zones is to attract more investment than you might otherwise get. It's a positive market distortion. You may say, or one may say, well, what about that region over there? People were going to invest in that region. They invested in this one. Yeah. So what are we now showing has happened? We're showing, and by the way, you need to do it you need to have enough of them. You can't just have one, because if you just had one, then you would create something different. But if you have enough around the country, again, you've got to pick them strategically. It's got to have local leadership, local ownership, so that you get the right, and they, presumably you go to certain parts of the country, they've got an expertise in biochemistry. You go to certain parts of the country, they've got agricultural technology, whatever it is. So of course, people have their different specialisms, but the importance of that is that you will actually improve the free market dynamic across the whole country, because I do not want my investors, who I think made an investment 2 years ago who want to make another investment. I don't want them going off to the enterprise zone 50 miles away. I want them staying here. So then I start talking to my MP and the minister and the government about, I start saying, this rule, we need to get rid of it. That thing, we need to get rid of it. Again, it's another idea, which is something I should have mentioned at the beginning. One of the things around local government was to create league tables for local authorities on areas where business cares. And you consult around what business cared about. That's the speed of planning approvals. That's how responsive they are to letters, how they do things. Because then we would start to shine a light on the poor performers and force and shame people to behave better. And I think actually putting opportunity zones will improve the whole country's regulatory framework more than is actually often recognised.
So there could be a sort of dynamic effect here, because it starts working in area X, area Y starts asking for the same sort of pro-enterprise approach. Julian, should that satisfactorily assuage the fear of a free market Puritan like myself, that if you start unlocking this, then we'll have a race to the top in terms of pro-enterprise policies?
Yeah, well, frankly, it's good enough for me. It is a second best, as you both would agree. I think what we want is a single free enterprise zone consisting of the entire United Kingdom. But if we can't do that for whatever reason, then this is a second best solution. But it's a good second best. And I like the idea of cities and regions competing. And effectively, I know this will give a head start to some, but it's a race that ultimately all should benefit from. So it's not the pure free market solution, but it's probably better than the status quo.
Okay, I want to finish on one last point, which goes to the STEM problem. Those studying science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's what it stands for, isn't it? Most observers do think we've got a problem here. But Bim, I want you to explain to me what the market failure is. Why isn't it that more people do this? If there are jobs and stuff at the end of it, why is everybody doing medieval literature or media studies rather than working out how to build bridges? So, and isn't there a danger in your plan, which I can see encourages these this sort of study, that the system could be gained enormously? You're sort of suggesting a write-off after 5 years if you've done a STEM topic and are in a STEM industry. I'm not sure how tightly that could be defined. Would the IEA start taking on an engineer to, by ticking the right box or the right form? So again, explain why you think there's a problem here at all. And I think most observers think that there is. It's not one I can explain. But if there is a problem, why wouldn't a more marketized mechanism solve it? Why do we need a kind of government write-off of potential loans or debts in order to encourage people to take that educational course?
So the first point to make is, because of our system, our university system, we don't have a pure market. We've got a funny mixed economy model that frankly I think needs a lot of work, but that's a discussion for another day. The market failure. So I came to this with a prejudice that was disproved. My prejudice was there aren't enough people going into STEM. And actually, I'm doing research and reading reports, and I quote one report, I think it was Nuffield Trust that did it around 2018. The failure wasn't there weren't enough people going into STEM. It was that there weren't enough people of the high quality, so there was a quality issue. And those that did go into it, the best students, didn't stay in it. They worked in another industry. Now, part of that's because I think of the City of London, I suspect. Part of that's probably because we've got quite a lot of foreign students that do STEM and then go back home to wherever they're from. So the question is, how do you gather those good students who are in STEM and get them to stay and work in it? And of course, after 5 years, some people will say, I've done my 5 years and now I'm off to work for Goldman Sachs as a software engineer or whatever. Of course, and you're going to have that. In the same way that Teach First has people who just teach for 2 years and then go off and go and become civil servants or something. But there are some people who work for Teach First who stay as teachers throughout their career who would have never otherwise gone into teaching. This principle, again, it's about saying, even if you can increase that by 10, 20, 30%, what that does to the viability of investing and manufacturing, in particular in the STEM area, in this country, alongside opportunity zones, alongside all the other things, infrastructure faster, etc. Overall, what you do when you do that is you make a much more viable and exciting place to put that sort of business. This really idea came out of a conversation, one of my commission called Damon DeLaslo, who's put factories all over the world. He's been involved in business for 50, 55 years. And I said to him, what is the thing that could get you to invest more, to move? I think he's got a factory in China. I said, okay, what would make you locate that in the UK? Tax incentive, this. He said, look, all those things are fine, but fundamentally, it's about access to good people. Access to good people, ability to get my goods to where their market is. And if you can get me those two things, they're the things that I care about. And, he worries about the skill base. In fact, he was talking to me about the difficulties of apprentices and graduates and all the rest of it. It's people. And if we can get more high quality people staying in it, I think that will make us a more investable proposition for international capital.
Julian, is this a market failure, and is this broadly the right policy response to address that market failure in what Bim says is hardly a sort of pure marketized system in terms of education, particularly between the ages of 18 and 21?
Yeah, well, I think, like any economist, I can see both sides and probably argue both of them. I think my starting point as well, Mark, was very much yours. If there is all this demand for people with STEM related degrees, then why is that not being reflected in the pay? I think actually the example that came to my mind as well, of course, there was the city example, and we have a lot of people who are doing rocket science at university, and then rather than actually going off to be rocket scientists, they're being derivatives traders in the city. And is there something we can do to encourage them to not to go into the city, with all due respect to my former employers, and instead to go into sort of manufacturing industries, whatever else it might be. I would have your concern also, though, Mark, about the policing of this. I'm thinking about the city example. One that came to my mind is fintech, which obviously is a booming sector, one that the UK seems to have an advantage in, but that's very closely related to the city. I mean, would we subsidise effectively the education of people who use their STEM experience to go into fintech, or is that too close to working in the city? I'm not sure how we would police the boundaries of this, but I do understand also Bim's point about the broader economic and social benefits of having more human capital, as economists call it, better educated, high tech workforce, if you want to put it that way instead, which might go beyond simply what they themselves are paying. And it's particularly important over the next few years as we sort of embrace global Britain and want to make the UK a more attractive place to invest. Then having that edge in the people skills and technology and so on, or continuing to have that edge, is going to be really, really important. So I think this might be a good example of where I'm willing to sort of bend my principles a little bit and be more sympathetic than I'd normally be to a subsidy for a particular group of people studying a particular subject.
Okay. Gents, we're clean out of time. The time has just completely flown by. All of us are going to have to keep our thinking caps on, I think, in the weeks and months ahead, because we've got a huge, quite apart from the human and the health cost of this crisis, we've got a huge economic hole to dig ourselves out of. I think the ONS this week has said that we've experienced the worst contraction in 41 years in the first quarter of this year, and that's despite the lockdown was only in place for 9 days in the first quarter. The second quarter's going to be a lot worse. Obviously, in terms of the government spending money to come to the aid of the economy, we're already now projected this year to have a £300 billion budget deficit. And to put that in some context, the UK's budget deficit for this year will actually be higher than the entire GDP of 149 of the 189 countries in the world. So reaching for government spending is going to be a difficult thing to do given those numbers. So that's why I think we need a huge number of people thinking through fresh, radical ideas that can supercharge our economy quickly, rapidly, and as Bim has said, can actually be implemented in weeks or months, not over decades. So, Bim, with that, I'd like to thank you enormously for joining us at this IEA webinar. It's always a pleasure to have you. I hope it's not too long before we can have you back in the IEA in person. That requires the catering industry to get underway again. But thanks also so much for the work that you've done for our friends at the Social Market Foundation on this commission. We'll make sure that the full link to the report is in the show notes below on YouTube. So if you want to read the report in full, just scroll down and you'll be able to click through it. Bim, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
And Julian, my thanks to you as ever for all of the work that you've done for the IEA in putting forward your ideas and thoughts about how we can recover from this economic problem, might even say catastrophe, and for joining us on this webinar. It's been terrific to have you, Julian. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, pleasure.
And thanks to all of our viewers. Thanks for watching us. Do remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That will mean that you don't miss any future IEA activity. Also visit our website, iea.org.uk, where you can sign up for free for our daily email newsletter. That will keep you informed of all of the IEA's work and upcoming broadcasts and podcasts as well. If you're willing to do something not for free, we would appreciate any donations, however large or small, and you can also donate through the iea.org.uk website. Thanks a lot for joining us. Special thanks again to Bim and Julian, my guests. Have a great rest of your day. Over and out.